Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the London Speaker Bureau. We hope everyone is safe and sound. Today, we are delighted and honoured to have Baroness Sayeeda Warsi and Daisy McAndrew with us. Baroness Sayeeda Warsi is a lawyer, author, businesswoman, and member of the House of Lords. She was Britain's first Muslim cabinet minister, chairman of the Conservative Party 2010 to 2012, and a minister at the Foreign Office until 2014. She rose to become an advisor to the leader of the Conservative Party, Michael Howard, in 2004, and was the youngest peer in the House of Lords, aged 36, in 2007. Daisy McAndrew regularly presents talk shows on Talk Radio, London Live, and has recently been presenting to Radio 4 on Radio 4's The World Tonight. She can be seen commenting on politics for the BBC and ITV most weeks, as well as reviewing the papers for BBC News and Sky News. As a participant, you should see that the option to ask questions, as always, using the Q&A function is at the bottom. We should be using that in around 25 minutes towards the end of the webinar. Please feel free to add anything in that. And with that, I will pass over to Daisy and Sayeeda.
Well, John, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And obviously, I also want to thank the London Speaker Bureau for organising today. I'm just sorry that we can't do these types of events, as my teenagers would say, in the real world, IRL, but we'll have to make do from speaking to you from our home. So welcome to my home in London, and a very, very warm welcome, of course, to Baroness Warsi. As John so eloquently laid out, she really has got the most amazing CV and experience of not just business, law, politics, but also, of course, as John mentioned, being the first female Muslim cabinet minister and campaigning for many, many years on race issues, on Islamophobia, both within the country and particularly within the Conservative Party in recent years. So lots and lots to talk about. And as John also said, please do send some questions, because as much as Sayeeda and I are looking forward to having a one-on-one conversation, we're particularly looking forward to hearing your questions and knowing what is occupying your mind at the moment. And of course, what's occupying most of our minds at the moment is COVID-19, is the coronavirus, is the global pandemic that we find ourselves in, and of course, the associated economic disaster that's befalling the country and the world. And so, Sayeeda, it would be peculiar if I didn't start off by asking you how your lockdown has been, how you have been, and how you found watching this pandemic and this crisis unfold, both from a personal point of view, but from a political point of view as well.
Hi, good morning, Daisy, and it's great to be part of this, and it's great to have human contact, even if it is remotely. I think coronavirus, as we've heard many times, doesn't discriminate, and so every one of us felt vulnerable, particularly, of course, for our families. And I have parents now. My father is over 80, and so we've been quite concerned about making sure that he's properly isolating. But I think where lockdown has been different is that it very much depends on how privileged you are. And this is something that I've uniquely spoken about throughout this period, to say that it's not the same for everybody. And I think those of us that are privileged and that have been lucky have felt that lockdown hasn't been as difficult because of the space that we're in, the access that we have to various things around us. And I think that hasn't been properly acknowledged. And in some ways, when we've been talking about a response, from a government perspective, I'm not sure that that response has always taken into consideration people's different circumstances. And we've already seen, for example, in the United Kingdom and elsewhere in Europe, where the number of people dying from coronavirus is far higher amongst Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities than it is amongst white communities. And I think those are the kind of questions that we have to keep asking. Some of that work is starting to be done. But the lessons we need to learn at the end of all of this is that what were the structural problems before coronavirus which magnified that vulnerability for certain communities and certain people in a way that it didn't for all of us. So I think from a business perspective, I'm in business, so I've been through the whole cycle of dealing with the issue of staff, making sure that staff were furloughed, making sure that, you know, we kept things on an even keel. How do we come back to this? We've now reopened. Responding to social distancing within a manufacturing environment has been challenging. We supply into the high street, so we went through a period where there was, we couldn't understand how things were going to go back to normal. The high street has now reopened in the United Kingdom. So we've started to see a surge, an upside to orders. But again, we don't know how long that's going to last. So I think the insecurity of it all, from a business perspective, has been challenging. But I think I have to congratulate certainly the UK government on the way in which it's handled a package of measures for individuals and for business and for the self-employed and for the small business owner, to try and make sure that we keep the economy going, because it is the kind of thing that is likely to affect people's well-being and mental well-being as much as the anxiety over becoming ill.
Sayeeda, you said there that you congratulated the UK government. I think you were specifically talking about probably the financial measures that have been put in place. But of course, there has been a huge amount of criticism, both within this country, but globally, about our political response to coronavirus on the health side of things. And we're reading today that other countries don't want our tourism. They don't, Spain's saying they don't want British tourists. So we're very aware that the audience today, the London Speaker Bureau audience, is very global, and many of those people are looking in on how we have dealt with coronavirus and not judging us to have done well. If you look at the statistics, our death rate is sky high compared to all European countries, only Brazil and America doing worse than us. How do you think that will be judged in the future?
I think at the core of all of this, Daisy, was an ideological battle. As Conservatives, and particularly the kind of strand of the Conservative Party that Boris leads and Boris belongs to, is a basic belief that you do not interfere in people's personal lives. And the concept of individual liberty is core to that. And therefore, I can understand the ideological battle that went on within the party, and particularly within the way in which the Prime Minister would think that we cannot tell people where they can go and where they can't go. We cannot tell people that they have to stay at home. We cannot tell people how they're not allowed to visit their families. And all of that would have instinctively gone against what he believed as an individual and what large sections of the Conservative Party believed. And against that was this very clear state interventionist approach, which was absolutely required in the middle of this pandemic, both in relation to health, in relation to people's individual lives, the legislation that we had to pass right at the outset, which in normal terms, in the real world, just wouldn't have been allowed to pass through Parliament, because so many of us would have had concerns about the draconian aspects of it. So I think because of this conflict, it took us quite a long time to make the tough decisions and to give out a clear message. And I think it's a real lesson in saying that as the world changes, we can't look at things through an ideological prism, but we have to be very pragmatic and respond to the situation, irrespective of whether we come from the left or right of politics.
And so, of course, the other issue that's rocked the world in the past few weeks has been the Black Lives Matter movement. As I mentioned, you have spent decades fighting for race equality or on race relations issues. You've been particularly outspoken about Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, but also within the country. Again, looking at our country from a global perspective and perhaps comparing us to the rest of the world, maybe specifically America, do you think it's fair to say that we think we have less of a problem than we actually do, that we believe we are a very, very open, multicultural society, when in fact there are problems that we really don't talk about very often?
So I wrote about this at some length, actually, Daisy, and I genuinely believe, as somebody who spent her whole life campaigning on issues around equalities and specifically racial equality, that we are better than most of Europe and the US and large parts of the world in dealing with this issue. But just because we are better than the worst doesn't make us good. And I think that's the bit that we've managed to get wrong, that actually as over time expectations have changed. And if you go back to my grandfather arrived in the United Kingdom back in the 50s, that was when my family first migrated from South Asia to the United Kingdom. The level of expectation that he had about equality of treatment was far lower, and his level of tolerance, of accepting bad behavior on racial injustice was far higher than my generation. And I think as time has changed and as expectations have quite rightly risen to say, you cannot, we cannot be in a society where it's all right to say no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. We cannot be in a society where you are racially abused at work. We cannot be in a society where your outcomes are determined by the color of your skin. Your life outcomes are determined by the color of your skin. We have made progress. Of course, we've made huge progress from where we were in the 50s and the 60s, but it's not kept up with expectations. So the challenge that we have now is we can either turn around to young people, many who, like my children now and my grandchildren who are now born in the United Kingdom, 6th generation, and say, well, I'm really sorry, but you still have to be put up with inequality. Or we can say, enough is enough. It's time now, not just to keep talking the language of equality, but genuinely, on an evidence basis, unpick sector by sector to ensure that the color of your skin does not determine either your health outcomes, your job opportunities, your grades at school, the way in which you're treated by the police. And we have to, as a whole society, be prepared to say, we've got to change this. It can't go on.
So do you believe in institutional racism? Do you believe in unconscious bias? I mean, Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, the official opposition in British Parliament, was saying just this week that he is sending himself on a training programme to unpick unconscious bias. Other people, many within your own party, say actually some of these training courses do more damage than they do good, that sometimes when you start to monitor a lot of these biases, you allow a grievance culture to progress or to fester. Where do you sit on that argument?
I think all of us carry unconscious bias. It doesn't matter. I carry unconscious bias. I've had my own journey on LGBT rights. It took me a long time to get to the point where I actually felt that I could, first of all, understand, learn, and then apologize, because there are comments that I feel that I've made in the past. So I think we're all on journeys and we all carry unconscious bias. The question is whether or not we're prepared to take that journey and we're prepared to challenge ourselves. And if we continuously challenge ourselves, we will hopefully get to a point where we do understand difference better. But I think this nonsense which came out of, sadly, my party, which is that if you start monitoring inequality, then you get more inequality, is as daft as the argument, and is actually as offensive as the argument that was put when I was far younger, which was that domestic violence is a personal thing. It's between husbands and wives. It's behind closed doors. We mustn't interfere with it. And there were people, when we first criminalized it and society said, look, this is wrong, who said, well, now that we're recording it, we've seen a surge of domestic violence. Well, no, what we didn't see was a surge in domestic violence. We saw a surge in people reporting domestic violence, because we finally said to victims of domestic violence that actually you have a valid issue, that you need to be heard, and that you will be taken seriously. And when people feel that that is starting to happen, we will see an increase in numbers, as we've seen, for example, on historic child abuse, where people have suddenly felt that, because as the Me Too movement did, where suddenly people feel, right, now this is being heard, this is being talked about, this is important, I will now also be heard. So just because people are now reporting more incidents of racial inequality doesn't mean that, racial inequality has gone up. It's always been there. It just means people feel now more confident to be able to report it. And I think that's the start of us solving it.
And I know that your own party, during the leadership election, vowed to have an inquiry or commission into Islamophobia, and then it got, some would say watered down, some would say expanded into a more general commission or inquiry into racism. Your reaction to that was not good. You said it was going to be a whitewash. What are your specific fears about that?
I think where I've spent many, many years now reporting specific incidents. I'm a lawyer by training, Daisy, and therefore I think you can't just make accusations without having substantial evidence behind it. And so whenever I raised this matter with the party, it was always a very specific case with evidence of what had been said and why I clearly felt within the parameters of what would be seen as racism. And when those cases have been submitted to the party and no action has been taken, and action has only ever been taken when it's been highlighted by the media and there's been a public, kind of furore over it, you start to question not the individual racism and incidents of individuals, because of course there will always be incidents of racism in every organization. You know, you will always have individuals, bad individuals within all organizations. But when an institution fails to respond to those incidents, then there is an institutional problem. And I genuinely believe that the way in which the party has dealt with it, from initially denying that it existed, hoping that it would go away, the kind of ad hoc way in which cases were dealt with, the undermining of people who were raising these issues, clearly shows that this is a party that is not serious about rooting out racism from within its ranks. And I genuinely hope that this inquiry that has now been set up is done in an open and transparent way, and we genuinely get to the root of what these issues are, and the party starts to take the matter seriously. Otherwise, we're going to be in the place that the Labour Party was, unfortunately, with the issue of anti-Semitism, and it's going to take years to repair.
And on a wider level, Sayeeda, politically and societally, what is the solution to some of these huge problems? I know you said before that there's a difference between having a seat at the table, which you did, you had a seat at the cabinet table, and actually being heard, and then presumably taking the next step of actually making changes. And with Black Lives Matter movement and so many other issues being highlighted at the moment, how do you see these issues being resolved? Do you see these issues being resolved? And if so, how?
I think a lot of the protests that we're seeing around the Black Lives Matter, the discussion around removal of statues, much of that is sometimes criticised as just being symbolism, and people using hashtags, people taking the knee. But I think that that symbolism is important because it allows people to say that I want to be anti-racist. You can't be neutral on this. You're either anti-racist and you believe in equality for everybody, or there's something slightly wrong with the way in which you see the world. And I think, therefore, symbolism is important because you're openly saying, I am anti-racist. But that has to be followed up with substantial change. So the symbolism is important as a start, but that has to then lead to substantial change. And that includes, you know, organizations can't just say, well, I'm taking the knee or I'm doing an event around Black Lives Matter. They have to then say, how many people do I employ at the senior level who are from Black, Asian, minority, ethnic backgrounds? What is my recruitment process? Is there something in the way in which I recruit which excludes certain kinds of people? When I do employ people who are from diverse backgrounds, do I allow them to be authentically themselves? Because I know there are a lot of women who are the first to get to somewhere, or people from minority backgrounds who are the first to get somewhere. They get there, they almost then have to pretend that they're not different in any way. Their very diversity, which makes them different, and I think makes them powerful and brings new ideas to the table, are then suppressed, either sometimes by themselves because they don't want to be the woman or the Black person in the room, and sometimes by others around them who want them to fit in. And I think that, therefore, we have to have a space where we allow authenticity around that table. And for me, when I was around that table, that meant a working class background, a Yorkshire Northern upbringing. I was a single mum at the time. I came from a minority ethnic background, and I never made any secret of that. And I think it was important. I mean, you'll recall that at the very first cabinet meeting, it was a beautiful summer's day, and often in summer I wear a lot of quite flowy ethnic kind of silks, and I walked in a pink kind of flowy outfit, and I thought, actually, this is me, and this is what I would do. And I'm not going to try and fit in with a grey suit and pretend I'm like everybody else, because I am different, and I can either own my difference and let people accept my difference, or I can try and suppress it. And then there's no point me having that seat at the table.
But Sayeeda, how do you make that change without doing either quotas or positive discrimination? And I mean, perhaps you are in favour of quotas and positive discrimination. Most Conservatives aren't.
Yeah, I'm not in favour of quotas, and I'm not in favour of positive discrimination. I am in favour of positive action. I think there are ways in which you can change your application process. There are ways in which you can change the interview process. There are ways in which, where you recruit, how you promote, which can be neutral. At the moment, many of these processes are actually biased and stacked against, for example, I mean, when I was in the Foreign Office as a minister, I would see that often the senior positions would not be taken up by people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And there was a type that we took on at the Foreign Office, Oxbridge, lots of them from private schools, and therefore automatically you're excluding the likes of me, who went to a very good university but didn't go to Oxbridge. I didn't go to a private school. I come from a working class home. So therefore you're excluding diversity of thought long before you're excluding people of minority races or different backgrounds or different faiths. So I think we have to look at ways in which our processes are keeping people out. And I think once you create a level playing field, and once we get rid of these issues around unconscious bias, I am absolutely convinced, as we saw with women. I mean, look, you go back through history, and when a woman in the civil service, when she got married, would have to leave. She wasn't allowed to carry on working because she, at that point, was considered to be a homemaker, because we didn't think women were good enough to do these roles, and it wasn't their main job. We've come a long way, although we've still got a gender pay gap. We've come a long way from that kind of thinking. I think we just need to change the mindset and create a level playing field.
I'm going to open things up to questions in just a few minutes. So just a reminder to anyone out there who's got a burning question for Sayeeda. Sayeeda has told me that nothing is off limits. She's happy to answer questions on anything. So do send some questions through using the Q&A portal if you've got any burning questions. Obviously, we're going to have to touch on Brexit. It would be lovely to have a Brexit-free zone, I think, for most people, but it is still there in the background. Negotiations have started again. I know you've called yourself a Brexiteer who voted Remain. Since that moment, so 4 years ago, how have you been watching Brexit, and what do you feel about it now? And has coronavirus and COVID-19 had an impact on Brexit, do you think?
I think the kind of culture wars that we're still seeing being played out around identity and belonging, that started, I think, in a huge way during that referendum campaign, are still being played out. I think the work, the protests around Black Lives Matter, again, I think you'll find a whole divide between Remainers and Brexiteers in that space. I also think that the way in which we could have dealt with COVID, had we felt that we had a future within the European Union and we acted collectively, and there were many cases during those early weeks when we weren't at the table, we weren't part of the decision making, we weren't responding to a Europe-wide approach to this disease, and a international pandemic required an international response. And at a time when we need more and more united international response, unfortunately, I think Brexit has made us part of a smaller and smaller club. And that's the part of it that I worry about. The fact that we couldn't, in the middle of this pandemic, just say, let's just pause and let's just see how this plays out, and let's see how the world looks after this, to see how we would, again, I think for me, it's this constant debate between ideology and pragmatism. And until we end up with pragmatic politicians who are responsive and agile and flexible in the way in which the changing world throws problems at them, we are unfortunately going to continue to make wrong decisions, because ideologically it's going to outweigh common sense.
Do you still see the divide that so many people talked about during the Brexit referendum, the divide between the haves and the have-nots, and the divide between Westminster types and perhaps the north of England where you are from? Do you still see those issues being as prevalent today as they were 4 years ago?
I think the last election, the last general election in the United Kingdom, was fascinating, because the normal divide between the right and left of politics was actually more along social liberalism and social conservatism. And therefore, we ended up finding interesting new groupings being formed in politics, and I definitely think that those divides are still here. I mean, unfortunately, not far from where we live was one of the largest kind of rallies and some terrible campaign messages during the Brexit referendum, which made people like me whose family have now been in the United Kingdom for over 70 years feel like somehow Britain was starting to become a hostile place, and I think the remnants of that remain, and as we approach what could potentially be an economic downturn, not just across the world but specifically here in the United Kingdom as well, that I worry about how the have-nots and the haves and the have-nots debate is going to play out, and whether it will be used as a way to again divide communities.
And I want to touch on, just before we open up to questions, because I can see we're getting a few in now, but something much more personal. Anybody who's seen you in the public eye for the last few years can tell that today you look amazing. You've lost a lot of weight. You've talked about it publicly. And I want to ask you about that. Also, we were talking about how women should be able to be female and talk about these issues. And you've also talked about how nobody talks about the menopause as well. And I think that's a really interesting issue, which is getting a bit of traction in the public arena now. But it seems to be one of those taboo subjects. It's like so many issues like that. And I just wonder what your view is. And also, secondary to the menopause and the female issue, women in the public eye, and how they have to sometimes pretend to be men or very masculine when they're not. The other side is also on the weight loss thing. Boris Johnson's been talking about the obesity crisis in the UK. We're the fattest European nation, bar Malta, he said. And of course, as we all are under the shadow of coronavirus at the moment, we know how damaging that is. What's your view on the obesity crisis and having more some of those libertarian issues taken away and being stricter on things like sugar taxes and so on?
Well, for me, I mean, I'm a huge foodie and have been all my life, and I cook, and a lot of our socializing is always around food. And I think in the public eye over the years, life became the way in which we live our lives as parliamentarians, the crazy hours, the way in which you can't really meal plan, you can't think about when you're going to be eating or what you're going to be eating, and you're socializing a lot and there's food involved. I think over time I piled on more and more weight. And then a couple of years ago, as I hit my kind of late 40s, just when you feel like the kids have grown up and you've got your life back and you're firing on all cylinders, and you probably feel more in charge of your life than you've ever felt, and you feel more intelligent than you've ever felt, you've got a bigger skill set, and then suddenly it felt to me like I'd been hit by a truck, a juggernaut, and that was the menopause, when suddenly it felt like I was finding it difficult to do the simplest of tasks, and it's so sudden. And one was surprised that this had never been spoken about, how my mom or my other friends or my aunties had never spoken about this. And surely women have been going through this for forever. And secondly, I just felt that I needed to do something about it. And I think at the time I described myself as a middle-aged pill-popping menopausal woman, and I wasn't going to be that woman. I felt I needed to take charge of my health, and I started on the journey at the beginning of the year. Lost quite a lot of weight, started weight training of all things, which when I was growing up, my generation, I always thought weight training was about very kind of muscular, unusual kind of look. But actually it's something that I started with, and it just made me feel much stronger than I thought I could have been. I'm now stronger than I've ever been, I think, than I was even in my 20s. And then lockdown, I think I was watching all these videos of people eating cakes and biscuits and putting on weight, so it's been a bit of a struggle just to make sure I keep going.
And has your success made you more interventionist politically when it comes to obesity?
I think we have to have a much more honest conversation about the harm that we're doing to our bodies and how we're doing that harm to our bodies, but also the underlying reason to it. Because look, if you are privileged, you can afford to buy good food, you can afford to buy better quality food, you can afford the time to prep that food, and you can afford the time to go off and do the gym and various other health activities. But sometimes, ultra processed foods, which are the underlying kind of problem for most of the obesity issues that we have, and fast foods and quick foods and unhealthy foods are sometimes a necessity. It is sometimes the cheapest and the quickest way to feed yourself and feed your families. So we need to look at things like food poverty alongside obesity. I don't believe, when people say, well, you can go out and buy great fresh food and you can cook for your family. I look now at the cost of some vegetables, which exceed per kilo the cost of meats. And therefore, there has to be something wrong. If I look at the kind of meals that my mum brought us up on, it's actually more expensive to make those meals today than it was 30 years ago. So I think we do have to look at the way in which food poverty affects people's lives and the response that they have to that, and the health, the obesity issues that then leads to.
Lovely. So I'm going to take some questions now. We've had plenty coming in. One here that says, what should corporations and other employers be doing to tackle diversity or lack of it, especially at a time where hiring levels may be lower? That's from Alison.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to the things that I was saying, one, making sure that your recruitment process is as neutral as possible, making sure that you're not creating barriers in your recruitment process. Going out, if you're in a position of authority, use that position of authority and say, I am going to go out and try and recruit these kind of people. Making sure that you just do an internal audit on both numbers and pay gaps will give you the statistics to say we have a problem and we need to do something about it. And then genuinely realizing that you can when you bring in difference, you bring in a different thought process. And at the time of huge change, the best ideas I find come from the people that I least expected those ideas to come from. And if all around you are the same as you and the same as you've always had, you're actually holding back your organization. So if you are only recruiting a very small number of people, make them count.
And so again, taking the problem or the issue even further back, a question here saying, do you think our young people's national curriculum should change? And if so, how? This questioner goes on to say, we install our unconscious bias at such a young age, pointing out gender race studies show differences when we're toddlers, which means that when people enter higher education and the workplace, those imbalances in our society are already affecting opportunity.
I absolutely agree. I think it has to start with school. The number of things that I now learn about that I never learnt about in school. I mean, there was a huge discussion that went on around the First World War and the Second World War. And at no point was there a discussion around how many nations around the world were part of that war effort. It was only because my own grandfathers, paternal and maternal, served in the British Indian Army that I had my own stories in history, but this was never taught at school. I remember being taught the British Raj at school, and in the end I did a history assignment on it because I wanted to tell my own story and my own version of what was being taught. But again, in history, I just remember now looking back, it was such a sanitized version of what actually happened. And in the end, at a time when over and over again history is written by the conqueror, history is written by those people that in many ways sometimes probably oppress rather than the oppressed, then I just feel that the oppressed story needs to be heard. Both sides of that story need to be heard, and we mustn't have a version of history which only tells us how great things have always been, but actually also deals with the not so great things. And there's no shame in that. Every nation has its good points and its bad points, but every nation has to come to terms with the fact that its history is not perfect.
And so were you applauding when you saw the pictures of the crowds pulling down the Edward Colston statue, or did you agree with Boris Johnson that they were thugs who should be brought to justice?
I don't think I agreed with either. I was really sad. I was really sad that democracy hadn't worked, because I know that there's been a long campaign locally to try and remove that statue. And I really wish that there had been, if you look at post-apartheid South Africa, truth and reconciliation is really important. And I think if if Bristol could have had a moment of truth and reconciliation, which was democratically couched, and people felt they had an opportunity to be heard, then I think whatever decision was taken at the end of that process, whether it was for the statue to remain or for it to come down, it would have felt like an inclusive process where people felt that they were being heard. And in the end, the fact that some people felt like the only way they were going to be heard was by pulling down, by physical violence of some sort, or pulling down this statue. I think that's a sad moment, because it shows that our democratic processes are not working and are not responsive to the needs of today's Britain.
Very interesting question here. It's an anonymous one. Saying to you, through your equality campaigning, have you found that discrimination and negativity are stronger in certain industries or certain locations? And if so, what kind of support do you think is needed to tackle the issue in those places where it is more serious? So interesting. Do you think there are industries or areas, pockets of the country or the world perhaps, where you think these issues are worse than others?
I think the statistics, if you go back to, look, I can go by my own personal experience, and I can also go by the evidence. The evidence is clear in areas like criminal justice, in areas around policing, in areas around, if you look at the number of people at the highest level in the law, in the judiciary, in the city, it's apparent that this is a problem across all sectors. But I think in terms of my own personal experience, I've seen it in some format right from school, where it was far more brutal and far more aggressive, right through to what I call the kind of subtle, respectable racism, I call it, where people rationalize it in the most respectable terms. And you see that even in the corridors of power, you see it in the Houses of Parliament. So unfortunately, it is present in all aspects of society, sometimes much more overt and sometimes more covert.
Well, that is all we've got time for. I just want to thank you again, Baroness Warsi, for talking to me and to everybody else and asking all those questions. I think we covered a lot of ground, but we certainly could have gone on even longer. But from me, Daisy McAndrew, and on behalf of Baroness Warsi, thank you so much for joining us this morning.